All right, all right. And welcome back, guys, to Self-Selecting Podcast. We're here today with someone like Lauren. I don't know if you know how much of a fangirl I am of yours. And that's how I want to start this. I want to make you really uncomfortable, like within the first 10 seconds, okay? Um, Laurin Conlin, you guys. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm so excited to speak with you today.
Oh my gosh, I'm so thankful. If you guys are watching the video, I'm probably blushing. So it's not just the blush is hitting today. I am probably actually blushing. So thank you for that. And I'm so excited to be here. I was thinking, I was like, when is the last time that we've like talked or interacted? And it's like I feel like the fitness space, when you've been in it for so long, it just becomes this like vacuum of time. And I'm like, I don't even know how or where I know people from.
You're like, "I recognize you, but how have we ever met in person?" It's like,
Dude,
yeah, no, with those
oh,
connections, and I so y my first Bikini Pro show that I saw in person
okay.
was 2015, you at the Dallas Pro,
Oh,
and yeah, like, ages ago, and,
true.
like, I mean, you and Lane were there, you're
Yep.
just, I mean, such a sweetheart, you're just like, "Hey, can I get a picture with you?" And, like, just it was so cool, it was so cool to
Touch.
see your journey at the time and like I mean just like the evolution of really your physique because at the time were you intermittently in and out of powerlifting, were you kind of supplementing tentatively or not, like I guess in those non-prep settings with powerlifting?
hmm Yeah, it's actually really interesting. So I had a pretty heavy or a heavier powerlifting background than probably most bikini competitors, right? I did actually do one competition, my one and only. That will really be the only one. I usually say like I'm never done with anything, but that I one and done was good for me. But I always trained with a heavy emphasis with the just like compound lifting in general. And before I got my implants, I was doing a lot of benching, but then even after that, I was doing overhead presses and love squats, love deadlifts, and was pretty much doing that through most of my preps at that time in particular. And I did have to eventually transition away from that a little bit just because I had so many injuries and just a whole lifelong of just all that kind of stuff. But I was very heavily, great memory, doing a lot of that back then.
I I know it sounds creepy. I know it sounds creepy,
That
but the reason I remember is because I mean, like at that time, I was in my first year of bikini competitions. Like I was an amateur, and I mean, like I was very much into like Team BioLane, just like that group of individuals, yourself included, who were really paving the way. I would say for the bikini division as a whole, because at the time, I mean, there really weren't a lot of individuals and challenging some of the written in stone beliefs around the way women are supposed to diet, the way women are supposed to train. And I mean, like, yeah, honestly, I think that I've said this in so many podcasts to this day. I'm like, I had people in my corner or people that I looked up to that were putting out very responsible messages early on and really grateful for that. And like you yourself, Lane, like Paul, all of you guys, like, y'all have imprinted and put me on a path early on in my career to honestly, I would say like make better decisions as that novice, as that unseasoned competitor. So this is literally, I'm so excited to have you on. If I'm going to say it like 10 more times, but
oh my gosh.
uh,
No, that literally means the world. And as someone who has struggled with content for really my whole career, but especially now more than ever, I so appreciate that message because it's like, okay, hey, like some of the stuff that I did share was actually helpful. And that's like really what matters to me, of course. So yay. I'm happy.
I,
It's good.
I'm so, yeah, no, I'm so excited we're getting to do this. And so, I mean, like diving in, I know right now, I guess for listeners who aren't as familiar as I am or individuals who were in the space back then, could you give us a little bit of a introduction? Just let listeners know who you are, what you do, what you're currently doing in the space.
Yeah. So it's been now over like 11 years. So I've been in the industry, right? And I did my first show in 2011 as a 19-year-old. And like pretty much right out of high school, I was like lifting weights, doing personal training, like kind of all of that, right? And so I guess I've been in the industry for longer than 11 years, but we'll just say that for official. Started competing, started going to Florida State, and then really was just like fell in love with bodybuilding and decided to really go all in with that while also learning. about the science behind it. And I started out as a dietetics major, and then I did switch to exercise science just because it was more of a fit for me. I helped out with some research while I was there. And then I was like, what do I want to do with my life? like quite literally, I always just knew like I liked school and I had more questions. So it was just kind of a natural progression to go to do a master's. And that is when I switched from, I'm trying to like tie everything together, right? It's like all the different like spaghetti strings. So I was competing actually as a figure competitor, LOL, for the first few years of my career. I don't know who I thought. I mean, man, the confidence of a 19-year-old natural athlete, like competing in an untested federation in figure. Like, who did I think I was? But I did that for several years. And then, because I just never really fit the bikini archetype as like a person, right? Like it just wasn't really like me. And then in 2014, I decided I was actually out with Lane's camps. And you remember Diana Dahlgren, I'm sure. And I'm kind of one of the other like OGs in the bikini space. And she was there and I was like hitting my figure poses and whatever. And she's like, girl, you're bikini. And I'm like, hello, look at me. And she's like, look at who just won the show you just did. Cause I was just at junior nationals. And I was like, and mind you, everybody at that show was also like, oh, where's the bikini meeting? Are you doing bikini? And I was thinking, no, I'm figure. And then I was like, okay, it's time. I was like, let me just try it. Like, why not? Right. I'm already scheduled to do this next show. Why don't I just jump into a qualifier, see how I do? And I ended up winning the show. And then I decided to do I decided to do Universe. I got fifth, and then I got third at USA's. And then that year, I actually ended up winning the overall at nationals. So that was 2015 or 2014, sorry. And that was in bikini. And then at the same time, I had started my master's with Dr. Bill Campbell. And we were like, what should we do for research? And he had basically like sold the whole lab, like we're going to do female physique research and like all this kind of stuff. And I was like, hey, I kind of want to do a dieting study. Is that okay? And that was really like a big thing that kickstarted my career. Also going back, I had started officially coaching in 2013, but then after I turned pro, Lane and Paul were like, hey, like you should make this like a real business and get like an LLC and like have a real website and like not just be like a word of mouth business. Like, can you actually legitimately do this? So all those pieces kind of started coming together, I would say, at that point. And then read my research study, graduated, and pretty much since then, I have been coaching and speaking and educating full time. And now I recently, last month, I guess, started back at USF to get my master's in clinical mental health counseling to become a therapist. So,
Wow.
yeah, that's a very condensed version, but competing, school, some research, running a business, speaking, and then now full circle back to school and going back for counseling.
Dude, that's okay. You're so humble. I'm going to okay, and I'm going to try to explain this the way I've explained it to others when I tell them about you. You put on research, like the only research on flexible dieting. Yeah, like am I misspeaking? Like
No, to my knowledge, this is still the only study that's looking at like a diet trial head to head. So we basically looked at, we had a group that tracked macros and we had a group that had a meal plan and we looked at a diet phase as well as a post diet phase. So to my knowledge, it is still the first study that has ever done that or anything close to that.
that, I mean, like truly is leaving a footprint in the industry and specifically within the component of nutrition within physique sports. And I mean, like, it's something that early on, like when I got into bodybuilding, I know our backgrounds, maybe some similarities in like early exposure to food restriction, even at like a prepubescent age. So it's like, okay, understanding energy balance is one thing, but actually leveraging it to be a competitive athlete who still has to perform and,
Yep.
ultimately has to progress their physique. You can't just restrict your way through that, which even at the time, 2015, like, bikini wasn't anywhere as competitive as it is now. However, the requirements were still far off for where I started in bikini. So getting myself to a point where I was like, okay, I am not finding success in these restrictive diets. Like ultimately that's leading me back to square one every single time, which at that point, I just took that as like, that's what everyone's doing. That's how these girls are getting to stage. So that must be the answer. The fact that, I mean, like, you not only have like continued to push that message, and really the notion that, like, food doesn't have to control you. There can be some freedom and some autonomy in your ability to modify your physique while still enjoying food, but to actually be the person, be like, yo, I left a fucking footprint in this space. Like, I did that and I proved it. Like, show me the research. Like, that's you. So literally, like, I hope listeners like understand that's not like, that didn't just like happen overnight. That took years. Like, that took
Ooh,
so long, right?
yes,
Um,
it's very
it's
long
incredible.
to me. Well, thank you. Yeah, most master's research is not like 22 weeks in length like our study was. And I just remember Eric Calvin being like, man, this was like a PhD level study that you did. And I was like, yeah, Campbell is the best. Like, shout out to Dr. Campbell. Still one of the biggest impacts in my life. And I will always say that on probably like every podcast as much as I can or any stage that I'm on. He changed the trajectory of my life and also gave me really the free reign to run that, which was like incredible and pretty unheard of for a master's program. And so I'm forever grateful for that he allowed my crazy vision to be like, here, let's do this. And just like the impact that has had. And for anyone who's interested, I did make the study open access. So I personally funded that. So you can all read it for free. And that was really important to me because it doesn't matter if it stays in academia to me, right? Like, I just want people to be able to read it. So it is an open access journal.
Guys, if you are listening, you're in the space of like, hey, you want to not just, I don't know, be spoon fed. I mean, I don't mean that in a derogatory way, but I mean, really, if you want to truly further your understanding, within the realm of research, go take a look at that. I will link that in the show notes below. Laurin, I mean, you've done incredible things for women in the space of physique sports, but as well as recreational competitors and non-competitors.
Good.
Now, I kind of brushed on this, and I know this is something that I believe this is something you're a big advocate for, but can you share with listeners, um, really, what was that pivotal moment for you early on? I mean, where you felt like you were first exposed to food restriction?
Yeah. So I grew up with an eating disorder. I was diagnosed anorexic. And I dealt with that for many, many years as an adolescent. And I would say probably around 8 was around the first time I was really trying to like possibly restrict or really started to have an idea of like, oh, food has calories or I feel bigger than other people and that kind of stuff. And then I would say at probably about 10 to 13 was really when it was like, it's kind of in the throes of that. And it was never from messaging, like it was never from like my parents saying like you should eat this way or you should do this. I always wanted to make that clear. It was never something like that. And I really was kind of like not in a normal like setup, like in terms of like being on the internet. Like I wasn't doing anything like that. It was truly like this self choice of me saying, oh, I feel like I'm bigger than other people. And my friend group, which I wasn't, but in my mind that I was. And then I just kind of started restricting what I was eating, just really at that point eating less. Like found a tape measure. Oh, I ate less. I'm smaller now. And then I also kind of started to develop some compulsions around movement and just a lot of just behaviors, right? That now looking back, I have a better understanding of. But okay, I have to like drink 2 bottles of water every time I sit down and eat. I have to like run a lot because I like running. I have to like do this many steps before I leave the house. It was a lot of like compulsive activity along with not eating as much. Now, I don't, I was so young. I kind of have like fractured memories of that time in terms of like, what did a day of eating look like? Like, I really don't remember that kind of stuff. I just remember very actively trying to eat less, move more. And also, I had a very deep understanding. Like, I could literally open the pantry and know all of the nutrition facts on something just because I had like memorized it. And which I guess semi served me later in life, but I had no idea at the time what that would all be. And then it got to the point where it was pretty bad. And then, of course, I did have to go, get help and, go to a dietitian and get and also get some therapy, which again, I don't really remember a ton of those times. It's interesting how our brains our brains love to remember certain things and then block out others, right? It's so great what our brains do. So I don't remember exactly like, oh, what techniques did we go through? What did we do? But it was, that was very much the mindset I was in when I was younger. And it's really sad, like looking back at pictures and seeing stuff. But, ultimately I had such an interest in food and exercise, obviously in a very disordered way at that point. But then when I've been able to use it in my mind for good, because it really introduced me to like, what is a registered dietitian? Like, what is healthy eating? And then I was able to, like I mentioned, I actually started as a dietetics major at Florida State. I started pursuing what I thought, oh, let me do this. So it did kind of come full circle. And of course, people in my life, when I decided that I wanted to do bodybuilding, were a little bit concerned because they were like, well, this seems a lot like kind of what you're doing before. And I was like, no, 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 it's different. But it is different. But it certainly was worrisome, of course, understandably, especially being so young. Like I said, I did my first show at 19, not really normal 19-year-old behavior. So, but yeah, so early on, I've been exposed to these types of things, and it's really carried with me, literally my whole like childhood and adult life.
I think a lot of listeners can relate to having distortions, really, not only in their body image, but also in behaviors around consumption. What is too much? What is too little? What's adequate? What is aligned with the kind of body they would like to have? What's socially acceptable? And I think when you begin to distill out, the similarities and really, I guess, the differences in basically day-to-day eating behaviors as opposed to physique-driven goals, specifically those related to getting on stage, there is a perpetuation of these behaviors. And as someone who also, has struggled with those compulsions, and I classify them as dysregulated behaviors, because in a contest prep, that is an aspect of it that I accept and I do label as like they're dysregulated. But there is the understanding that post-show in a non-prep setting, the intention is to re-regulate those behaviors. It's to iron them out. It's to find that normalcy, not to sustain them and continue to perpetuate them if there isn't utility in them. What I find is coaches that there are a lot of individuals who don't know how to really diffuse between that dysregulation and finding that sense of normalcy in day to day. So there's almost this sense of like, I'm going to continue to compete with living the bodybuilder lifestyle. I'm going to continue to compete even though I'm technically not on stage. And ultimately, what I see is like these individuals who, and again, like I've been there myself. So it's like individuals who feel the need to rise up to a certain degree of competitiveness, even in these non-prep settings, which ultimately I think tends to self-abandon, tends to put people in a position where heavily disassociated with physiologically hunger signaling, but also truly what is the enjoyment that they're getting from this process, this yes, control of their body image, but the actual like pursuit of building their body. What's your experience been with coaching and specifically coaching the physique athlete?
Yeah, so I just want to say, like, broadly speaking in general, first, that a lot of disordered behaviors are very just like emotion driven. And a lot of people think that they're related to food. And for some individuals, that is true. But generally, issues that we see surrounding food are behavioral issues and emotional dysregulation issues. So oftentimes that becomes like almost the outlet for that. And if people are not addressing the actual emotional reason behind that, it's really hard to get past those disordered behaviors. So I do want to say that first and foremost, because that could be anyone who's dealing with that, not just, physique competitors, because there's definitely something that's so prevalent, unfortunately. And it is just when you really get down to it, it's like, this is an emotional based response. But that also does like interplay with physique athletes as well, right? And what's so interesting about working with physique athletes is that not only, and especially bikini athletes, I think that the bikini athlete is of particular, let me say this, it's a particularly challenging client because there's all of the physiological things that we're dealing with, all of the psychological things that we're dealing with. And then there's also this still pervasive notion that like bikini is easy And bikini is something that we can just jump into because it looks normal and like, yeah, I want that body. And we don't really sometimes realize, and we can do it too. Even people who have competed, how many times, anyone who's listening, how many times have we romanticized that look, that body, that experience, forgetting the whole other 6 months of like getting there? We're just like, no, but it really wasn't that bad. And our brains love to do that. We love to forget all of the little details that we're going through for good reason, right? Because if we remembered everything at like the peak intensity, that would be really troublesome. But oftentimes we can even ourselves romanticize being that lean, having that look, and how, yeah, I could just get there. So bikini athletes in particular are working against this very unique problem. And it's so pervasive on the individual level as well as the industry level. Just like, yeah, just competing it, just get a little leaner, just pull a few pounds off, just tighten your glutes up. And it's like, I understand that that is like how easy it is to fall into that. And especially when someone doesn't have the support system or the behaviors in place for both to really kind of guide them out of that. And if they are maybe, working with a coach who wants to just push, 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 or they maybe everything in their life is kind of just falling apart right now. And they're like, I want to just focus on this. But now there's really like no regulation for them. And they just keep diving deeper and deeper. And let me just do another show. Let me just place better. Oh, if I just came in a little bit more like this. And it becomes this really narrow focus of I have to do this. And we sometimes then realize like, am I even doing this for the reasons that I set out to do this? So physique competitors in general have just like this unique, like I said, physiological and psychological response that we're trying to manage. But then the bikini athlete in particular, and not saying other athletes don't deal with this, but there is just this notion that like, yeah, because bikini girls like look normal and they're not too big and bulky, like it's just, we just get up there. Like I can look like that. And it's just that nothing could be farther from true.
I couldn't agree more. And I do think like this is the aspect of the sport that a lot of people, they do want to make it seem like it's still, a physique that is achievable within a year. And
Same.
frankly, I think like with the look currently, I mean, like that is just so far from the truth. And ultimately, like what I've seen in the evolution of the judging requirements, what individuals are bringing, even just to like the national stage, it's like that look is becoming denser, it's becoming leaner. And there are far and few athletes who are willing to go about it without any kind of assistance.
Yep.
And that route, I mean, like it isn't cost free. And I mean, like I think it was Eric Helms who had made the analogy around like, you incur some degree of like prep debt every single time. And like how you choose to pay that off, how you accrue it, you can just ignore it. And then you can get out of prep and be like, oh shit, like I've almost maxed out. Like I'm almost past my spending power. Great. This is going to be not only a lengthy post show, but it's going to be just as long, if not twice as long as the prep itself. And I think a lot of individuals, they can assume it's like, well, yeah, just get your hormones right. And it's like, yeah, just get all your hormones right. Just get them. And what does right even mean? Like, let's
That
get them
too.
balanced. It's like, like it kills me. I know if it bothers me to the degree it does, I know it's gotta bother you. Um,
So much. And I love the debt analogy. I always like to say that the adaptations that we're dealing with hormonally and metabolically and even just mentally, right? They're all compounding. And there's no real scientific term for that, but I just see that they compound over time. And like you mentioned, at some point you're going to have to pay them off. And we always have to remember and reorient ourselves to say physique athletes, the people who do the best are genetically gifted because that's how physique sports work, right? Like if someone has certain structure and shape, they're going to do better in certain division, just like any other athlete in any sport, right? Like if you're a swimmer, and I'm not going to use a lot of sports analogies because I'm not a sports person, but swimmers, I generally think have long arms, right? That's helpful. I'm like, I'm going to say like the wrong thing. I think they have long arms, so we're just going to go with it, right? People who are swimmers, like if you fit a certain body type, you're probably going to do better. Not to say that if you don't have that, you're not going to do well, right? But it just helps. Same thing with physique sports. If you have a 22-inch waist and you have glute insertions that go down half your hamstrings and a bubble butt and, great delt, like hello, like you're going to do better. Like, and that's not saying that you're not working hard or someone else is But it's just, we have to think about who's going to do better in certain physique sports. People who have certain genetic predispositions. Also, that doesn't just go for like the shape of our body, that goes for how people's bodies respond. And after working with clients for so many years, and I think you know this too, everybody responds differently. Some people can put in like 2 cents and other people have to put in $20 to get the same response, right? And oftentimes we're only looking at that end result. And the person who put in those 2 cents, it's not taking anything away from them. But what it's saying is that the person who put in $20, they have to take quite a bit longer to recover on all of those fronts. And if they don't, that $20 is going to become a 20K debt really, really quickly. And the 20-cent person has already recovered. So that's where we have to really start to reorient. It's not just about how hard can I work this one time. It's about what else am I going to be dealing with up against the next, maybe season or at the end of this season, and really like the rest of your life. And if we're talking about women in particular, that, dealing with hormones and dealing with all that is a very, very intricate process. And it is not something that everybody bounces back from as quickly.
And I think across that discussion, I mean, like the aspect I find probably the most challenging to have with clients is explaining individuality and resilience, not just in their hormonal profile and how that may be affected by decisions they've made thus far, but even really just around the behaviors and the tolerance in which they can restrict. I know for some people, like, I mean, suffering is relative, and like the degree of a lift that it actually is to be in a 250 calorie deficit versus a 750 calorie deficit. For some people, they might be like, yo, like I'm getting in that yellow, orange, red. Okay, like as soon as I hit that threshold, now I'm going to spiral, and ultimately I'm not going to be able to pull back fast enough before incurring real, I don't want to say damage, but before now having collateral that can't be ignored. And I think when it comes to the behaviors around food, I mean, this is something that I do feel very strongly about, and it's the interesting thing is like when you start talking to other coaches, you get a better sense of like, okay, like what is their centerpiece in how they go about coaching. And something that the impression that I've always gotten from you with the kind of content that you put out and the way you carry yourself and present yourself online is very much that you care a lot about the why in certain behaviors, specifically with clients, and maybe the discrepancies and why they're struggling to maintain some degree of adherence, why the non-adherence is occurring, why it's creative versus non-creative. And I think this is an aspect that over the years, I did initially think, okay, well, for my coaching, for me to be a better coach, it's going to come with learning how to peak people in this super sexy, nuanced way. And really, like the turning point where I felt like I was actually providing much more value was going the route of identifying the whys and becoming a little bit of a detective and figuring out like, it's not just that you went off track. We need to peel back the layers. We need to talk ourselves into the corner. Here, talk me into the corner with you as to figure out the root cause.
Yes, I love how you use the word detective. I think that's such a great way to describe it, because I always feel like we are gathering data and then basically saying, okay, I'm hearing all of these things based on your responses and what you're saying and your actual responses of what you're doing. Here's what I'm seeing. Is this correct? Is this not correct? Here's how I think we should proceed. How do you feel about that? Right? Because everybody's life is so different and so unique in terms of like, again, the obvious stuff in terms of their body, but also their mindset and what is actually going on in their life. Right. And a lot of times we all are so guilty of this, myself included. We can sometimes compare ourselves. We try to do like a one-to-one comparison to someone who is living a completely 180 different life than us. So it's like, oh, well, why am I not responding this way? Or why don't I look like this? Or why am I not doing that? And it's like, hey, am I living that life? Do I even want to live that life? Or does that actually just look like this great thing that I want in this moment? But when I really sit back and think like what they're doing, that's not even incongruent. That's not even congruent with what I want in my life. So why am I desiring this? Right. But sometimes it can be really hard to check ourselves, especially in this like social media world, where we're only seeing certain aspects and we're not really taking the whole picture into consideration. But absolutely, we have to think, okay, what is actually going on in the life of our client in a holistic way, and really approaching coaching in that sense. And I recently started last year a coaching mentorship. It's called The Art and Science of Coaching, because literally the art of coaching, in my opinion, is one of the most important things that we can do, and really developing creative ways to go about coaching. Because like you said, you always thought, oh, maybe it's going to be like this new peaking strategy. Maybe it's going to be this, maybe it's going to be that. And sometimes there are pieces of information that we learn that we're like, oh my gosh, like that's going to be a huge like benefit to my clients. And like immediately, let me add this. But the best things that we do are like the bigger frameworks where we're able to understand like, wow, I can apply this thought process, not to just one client, but to the next 10 clients that I work with, because I'm able to adjust it based on their needs.
I love it. And I think, to continue within that realm, it's like having the ability to extract the data that the client might not realize is as important. That, in my own experience coaching, has been a huge turning point. And I mean, like, for listeners, if they're familiar with my content, then they know, like, I put a lot of emphasis, like I do the spreadsheet thing. Like I'm very data driven in the sense that the objectives, that is how we're primarily going to make decisions. However, it's not to say that the subjective data that's collected each week, it's not to say that that might not challenge, that might not challenge the objective data, as simply as like, hey, like, what's your perception of what we're doing? Well, if you take a client who, like, technically they're adherent, they're making the progress, they're hitting the target rate of change, okay, great. Well, by that theory, we shouldn't change anything. But if what's reported is, yeah, I'm following it, but this is really fucking hard. Like, this is actually harder than I anticipated, because it's the first time in my life I've been able to string together this many days without going off track. It's like, okay, that is feedback for me to know that, okay, this is not a client, like, even if the rate of change had slowed that week, this isn't an opportunity to continue to dig. That wouldn't be the correct move. Ultimately, that would shorten that client's runway in this fat loss phase. And I mean, for clients of mine who know this, like, I have on my spreadsheet for their weekly sheets, you have the objectives, then you have the subjectives, and there's this athlete feedback section where I actually prompt the clients. I'm like, what are the things that you're noticing about your physique day to day? Like, you get out of the shower, what are the things you see? Okay, what's your perception around the rate of change? Like, for some clients who are highly anxious, 1.5 pounds lost per week, they're still like, no, I'm not happy with this. Like, and it's good for me as a coach to know that as soon as possible, to know that there's already this baseline anxiety being generated, just because in their minds, they don't understand why a 2-pound loss per week is going to be too aggressive. But I think with any style of coaching, I think one of the biggest hurdles I've run into, which I would love to hear your thoughts on, is the reporting of non-adherence.
Mhm. In what specific way? Like how to ask it, or how to broach the subject of them reporting that they didn't follow? So which
I guess, yeah, let me formulate that into a
No, you're
question.
good, because I'm
Sorry.
like, those are two. No,
Um,
I can answer both, but I want to make sure I answer what you wanted.
yeah, no, no, no. So for instance, I have one of my columns is like dietary deviations. And it's very open-ended, and it's just yes or no. And then I'd like to see, okay, like, what actually was the deviation? Because for some clients, like, a deviation is, hey, I swapped the carbs in meal one for a Dave's bagel, but it actually comes out to the same. I'm within like 2 to 3 grams over or
Yeah.
under. Versus dietary deviation, yes, I had a busy day. That's it. There's no further reporting. So I guess the question I'm trying to ask, with your clients, with your experience coaching, um, when it comes to deviations, do you find that clients are, I guess, do you find that clients are able to self-report regularly, or is that something that you do have to dig for, or almost create a system in place where they feel safe to report that?
Got it. Yes. Love that question. So I would say in general, some people, as we know, you will have clients who will disclose everything about their week. And then there's clients who cross the board, they're pretty low key and don't really share a lot. And usually those are the people who they'll just like drop in something like out of nowhere. Like they'll just drop something crazy and you're like, whoa, I didn't hear any of this beforehand, right? So one thing I started implementing was a self really like a self grading on almost all of my subjective measures and talking about it in a 1 to 5. So across all the domains that we ask, I will say like on, 1 to 5, 1 being this, 5 being this, where were you this week? Right. And if you need to expand more. Now, some people use it as an opportunity to just write the number. Other people use that as an opportunity to write the number and write a full, multi paragraphs about that. And then usually it's kind of a mix. Sometimes there's numbers, sometimes there's a mix. So usually what I'm doing in that instance is it's taking me several weeks with a new client to really understand how are they going to share this information on a week to week basis, right? If someone kind of historically doesn't share that much, I'm not really concerned. The client who is always sharing a lot, who doesn't, hey, okay, red flag for the week, what's going on? So that's number one, is I'm just trying to kind of build a case, not really on a week basis, but like on a, multi-week basis with them. And then I find that by having lots of different questions across that way, it allows them to feel good about like, you know what, sometimes I want to share, sometimes I don't really want to share as much. We also added in a section on biggest wins and biggest barriers for the week. And that's been probably the most helpful space for all of that, because even if someone just kind of puts in just the numbers earlier, if they, if they're kind of just feeling not as open, generally they always will pull something out. And even if the win was, I didn't have a win this week, that is still information for me, right? Okay, well now let's talk about why were there no wins this week? I saw a win here. How did you view this, right? Because if I'm seeing 4s in 3 domains, those are wins. Like that's out of 5. Like 4 out of 5 is a win, right? So that's where we have to like. I know that's not really a direct answer, but it's more so like asking in enough ways that it gives people the opportunity to share, and then kind of tracking that over time, and then seeing where maybe they're struggling, and then kind of pulling out those different words. And actually, this is a technique that I didn't really realize was a thing, but now in the starting program for counseling, I'm learning some of the things. I'm like, oh, this has a name, the thing that I do that I didn't really know, you know what I mean? And sometimes it's called restating, where you will say someone says a word, right? And then you pull out that word. And in a counseling setting, it's very different than what we're doing, of course, with clients. But if someone says a word that really kind of stands out to me, or says it even multiple times throughout the update, okay, this is something that we need to touch on, right? So that's really giving me clues. So I'm really trying to ask across a few different time points, so it gives them that opportunity. And then I'm always trying to be, encouraging. And anytime someone does share something with me, I'm like, hey, thank you so much for sharing. So they do feel for future times that they can, share that with me. Oftentimes what happens a lot, which I think is kind of probably what you're getting at, is that sometimes people will report something like, hey, this was just off, or this wasn't good. And then you're like, okay, now what direction could I go? There's 117 different reasons why this could not be good. So in that instance, that's when I will, 2 things. One, I don't want to probe too much, because if they wanted to share, they would have, right? So I don't want to probe too much, but I also don't want to just leave that and be like, oh, okay, well, try better next time. Have to kind of figure something out. So let's say a common example would be a client who is going somewhere, let's say for like a social event or a trip or something, and they're around people who, don't eat like them, and are just kind of in a situation now where like, hey, I have my life and my goals, and then I'm now in the situation where like I'm not in that. And a lot of people can feel quite a bit of tension with that. And so if someone has reported something like, yeah, I was doing this, and it's just a bad weekend, really off track. Like, all right, totally understand. Like being off track happens to everyone, myself included. We all struggle with that. XYZ. If there's anything else from the update that I could pull in there, I'll mention that. But hey, this week before our next check-in, like I would, could you write down a few things that came up? And I might give like specific prompts in terms of, the situation that they talked about. What exactly was challenging about this situation for you? What did this bring up? Like whatever it might be. And then the next week they'll be like, oh, okay. So now they can share a little bit more. Does that answer
Yeah.
more?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. And I think that's super helpful for listeners as well. Because how do I want to say this? I think there are times where clients they I guess I'll say it this way. The dynamic with coaching and clients in our space is really fucky. Because oftentimes I do think clients like feel like there's feel like oversharing or feel like even asking questions or admitting to fault or deviation can be met with disappointment, shame, ultimately just negatively reinforced. And I
D'accord.
think in my mind, like I try to do something similar where it's like, hey, I need you to know this was a big win, you even reporting that you deviated, because it would have been, I wouldn't have known. Like, there's no way I wouldn't have been able to, like, oh, well, I think she's deviating. I
But
saw it. So the fact that you even took ownership is like already like, let's count that as a win. And it's not for anything other than like, you took ownership of a time that ultimately it doesn't really move the needle, or it's not really, it's going to be a drop in the bucket in the grand scheme of things. But if we can at least use this as an opportunity to figure out, okay, why did the deviation occur? Now we have something to work with. Now we can at least figure out alternatives if you're in that same position again, which realistically, if it wasn't isolated, you're probably going to be in that position again. So I love the query just around like, hey, prompting them like, how did it make you feel? Can we label exactly what the feeling was? Which I am big fan of, is figuring out, okay, like what was the moment right before the deviation happened? Because like, even though it's subconscious, even though it's you deciding, okay, I'm going to break, like I want this discomfort, I want this feeling to go away. What was the tipping point? What made you make that decision, even subconsciously? And I think the more clear we can get on that, and like as coaches, we can help guide clients to explore that and show them like, hey, the closer we can get to the answer and being really specific with that answer, we might have some opportunity to prevent this from happening again, or at least reduce the magnitude in which it happens. And if we can like parallel this to, hey, you see how this is causing you a lot of shame and guilt right now? You see how this like feels bad? The way that we get away from this feeling is by solving it. So the way we solve it is to explore it. Even though that might be uncomfortable initially, I can help you do it. Let's go through it together.
Absolutely. And there's really no downsides to being more introspective. And there's no downsides of cultivating that practice in your life. And this just doesn't go for just eating behaviors, this goes for everything, right? But it's one of those things that is so, so valuable, because then clients are becoming more autonomous in that process. They are able to then catch themselves when they're either falling into that thinking behavior, or it could just be an actual pattern, right? Like it could be an emotional thing. Hey, this happened because I was feeling this way, or when I'm around these people, I feel this, or insert whatever emotion, right? That is something that we can navigate. But it could also be something, it could just be a behavioral thing too. Like, man, every time that like I'm at a party and, I find myself like snacking, like excessive snacking, how common is that, right? That people are dealing with. And it's sometimes it's as simple as going like, well, how do we end up there? Well, I end up there because I always end up gravitating towards the kitchen. And then I start talking, and then I'm so invested in my conversations that I start snacking, and I don't even realize that I've started snacking. So that could be something as simple as saying like, hey, let's just maybe try to move the conversations. And that's not to say that like snacks are bad or being in the kitchen is bad, but we also want to set people up for success. And I had a client actually relay this information to me recently, and this was so, I thought, important. So this kind of, I think, ties in with this really well. And she was sharing how in the fitness space in particular, on social media and all of this, it's really pushed that like, if you can't have, we'll just call it junk food or any kind of higher calorie palatable foods in moderation, like you have a bad relationship with food, and you should be able to fit those into your plan. And she was like, for me, honestly, like it's just really hard to regulate that. And I definitely feel better when I don't have it. And it's not to say that I can't have it, but I'd rather go out and do that and just keep my environment like free of those things, because there is that like subconscious, like half of a second where like, if you are in a certain situation, like just having it there is not conducive for you. And it's so interesting how that message, because I can sometimes forget like the messages that are so pervasive, and it's like, yeah, that is so true. Like, why put yourself in that situation? And not every client's going to feel like that. But for that client, she really struggles there. And that's not to say that she can never have those foods, because she's learned to moderate herself really, really well around them. But it's almost like, why even give myself that opportunity? So sometimes it's an emotional thing that we're learning introspection, and sometimes it's a behavioral thing. And those are generally like a little bit easier, at least to fix. The emotional stuff is going to take a little bit longer. But sometimes the behavioral stuff, you're like, wait, every time I do this, then this happens. Okay, let me actually just remove that or change this. And then, wow, that makes it so much better.
I think at least to pump the brakes if it's a repeated behavior that's unwanted. And I think that's so important to have the client almost like give the teach back, be like, hey, this isn't a behavior you want to continue, right? Like we're in agreement about that. It's like, hey, I love highly palatable food. It doesn't make me feel the best. I know I have a propensity to overeat it. So, what are the behaviors that are facilitating me overeating it, having it in the house? And maybe I can have it in the house if I'm in a state or phase in life where stress is highly managed. I have something for my clients where not every client, but I will, especially for clients who are really struggling with adherence, I'll have them log more of like a adherence scaling criteria. So 1 to 5, and it's not even necessarily to say if we're on the lower end of this, like 1 or 2. It's not to say that you're non-adherent. It's is your motivation high? Like, are you still committed to what we're doing? Are you like, and that's okay if you're having days that are 1 or 2, but it's better that we identify, is this the state that you're living in? Like, did you sign up for coaching? Did we enter this phase thinking that, okay, like you have the motivation because you believe you do? But what we find in actuality is that day to day, because of this, that, or the other, adherence is going to be more tried on a regular basis. And in that case, it's not about like making this permanent rigidity, this, this rule that, okay, we can't have cinnamon toast crunch in the house, but maybe in a state where willpower is going to be lower, where we're going to be going through that resource more regularly, we don't have it on hand. Because I know for myself, if I put myself in that environment, I'm more than likely going to make a decision that it's not exactly aligned with my goals. And I would rather not give in to that temptation, and if I can make that harder to access that food, that might be a solution, while simultaneously working on resolving why that emotional bond is to overeating and what can that be replaced with.
Mhm. No, absolutely. And I love that exercise. I love that you add that in with your coaching because that is so valuable. And that just really speaks to, again, the customization of coaching. What is someone going through? And that is changing maybe every few weeks, right? Like most people that I'm working with, and I'm sure you as well, like they are very busy. They have a lot of hats that they are wearing. They're juggling a million different things. So it's about saying, okay, how can I make this more conducive to someone's life? Now, it doesn't mean that I'm going to like give them all the answers and tell them exactly what to do, because that's just not in alignment with my coaching, doesn't not yours either. But it's about saying, okay, what are some strategies that we can make this easier on us and not drain our willpower for these kinds of things? Because you like that's a not a great use of our resources, right? Especially when they're already limited. And I think it's something too, like a lot of times when we're talking about, again, the high calorie, high palatable types of food, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I'm all about people enjoying those kinds of things. But I have found that when clients are able to actually actually fully enjoy them, right? And say like, I'm going to like go and like have this really nice meal and I'm going to like let myself have this and I'm going to be fully present for it. They get so much out of it. Like they truly enjoy it. They usually eat less, right? Because they're much more present and aware. And then they feel like satiated from it. Versus if they're constantly falling into situations, ones keep going with this like snacking situation, right? Like they keep falling into like, I'm really stressed out and then I, go in the pantry and I get this and I just have these snacks. Like you're engaging in these behaviors, but you're not really ever fully present with them. So you're not even really getting any enjoyment out of them. They're just kind of this coping skill. So it's kind of like the worst of both worlds, if we're being honest. So we have to say like, it's never about the food. It's about what is the behavior and what is the mindset around that. And that takes quite a bit of time to develop. And so anyone listening who is struggling with that, this is not something that like in 4 weeks you like fix or you figure out. Like this is a quite a long process. And I just want to make that clear because I think a lot of times people hear this and like, yeah, well, it sounds deceptively simple, but it's much harder in practice.
I think that's so important to clarify, because it really, in my experience for my own career in bodybuilding, but along my own physique goals, I found it to be more of like a daily hygiene, and it's more of a fluid state that I have to monitor and be like, okay, am I eating for consumption, enjoyment, pleasure, for the experience? And it's not to say that any is wrong. I just know that when I eat for consumption, that tends to be aligned with me making poor food decisions in like relative to performance, as well as using it a little bit as a crutch, which I don't feel like is aligned with the kind of physique goals that I have. And I think like that kind of awareness for how long I've been in the space of bodybuilding. I mean, I've been tracking macros and following some kind of diet in or out of the sport since I was about 15. So it's like even being, as I would say, as experienced as I am in the sport and having, the motivation of like, okay, the stage is going to, be a milestone for me, is still something that I find that without that awareness and that constant, maybe not constant, that regular auditing, it can be something that people do assume is like, oh no, you just need to want it bad enough, or you just need to have enough discipline. And it's like, I feel like a lot of people, specifically in the post-show phase, they chalk it up to like, well, you just need to go through the right reverse. You just need to have the right coach. And I know we're coming up on our time, but that is one of the topics that I want to get into. If
Oh,
you're good, still good
so
on time.
so good. Yes, I love this topic, and it is so important and even more misunderstood, I feel like, than regular dieting, which I've tried to speak on this so much. But the post show phase, again, taking into consideration not only the physiological and psychological changes, but now also this very unique situation that bodybuilding presents, which is just like, now what? And also like, what if I didn't place how I wanted to? And like, how do I feel now about my self-worth? And we start to uncover a lot of really, really challenging things. And they all seem to hit at the same time, which is so terrible. Like weight sticks so weird. I don't care who your coach is. I don't care what reverse you're on. And after a show, when you are absolutely shredded and you start to gain weight, I have yet to meet someone where it just kind of like comes back on. It is like, it feels like there's like a paint like brush where they're just like splashing like adipose tissue on. Like it's just, it's so awkward. You're like, why do I feel like I have fat here, but like not here? And then it's just, it's such an uncomfortable feeling, right? And then of course for like women, I
Yeah.
feel like it always just like, we always just notice it in like our stomachs and like our faces first. And we're like, why not the glutes? Why not like literally anywhere else besides here? And then of course, couple that with like, let's say like hypothetical, you just finished out your season, you didn't place how you wanted to, right? Like, which is a real reality that we have to consider. There's only, one winner in every show. So you didn't place how you wanted to. You've had a really long prep, and maybe you kind of ignored the other things in your life during your prep because you were so focused on this. And now the show is over. You don't have the outcome that you were desiring, that you worked towards. All the things in your life that you've been ignoring are still there, but they feel really magnified. And everything feels really magnified because you're really fucking hungry and like run down, and you probably don't have super great hormones. So there's just like a lot that's all happening right after for individuals. And it cannot be overstated how challenging that is, regardless of what strategies you're using.
Yes. And I mean, I think that is the raw and honest truth, is that, my mindset post show, like, yes, there are individuals who come out of it, let's just say seemingly easier. But even then, I'm very skeptical when individuals, I feel like there's a little bit of a honeymoon period. But
Yep.
foremost, what they're looking at, what they can expect is dysregulation, and in quite physically moving in the opposite direction of what they've been moving towards for the last several months. And for some, that prep, even that pre-prep period, that gearing up for the contest prep itself, I mean, you might be looking at the past year. Now it feels like you're very much undoing that yarn. And I think, like Team 3D MJ, Eric Helms, Alberto Nunez, all the guys, they are very, like a very good beacon within the space on the recovery diet, and really pushing like, hey, we got to get you out of that danger zone, that zone where like just quite frankly nothing productive is happening. But the longer we try to hold on to this, ultimately it's just going to make that re-regulation that much harder. And for a lot of people, I mean, like even those that are highly motivated, highly disciplined, I still feel like some degree of acceptance of like, you're not going to be able to execute perfectly. So, what can we do to calibrate expectations? And I believe this was one of your podcasts from forever ago. I don't even know who it was with, but you were talking about like intentionally building in like you're going to have those untracked meals. You're going to have meals where maybe the intention is to loosely track or even like just make good decisions, but we're going to build this in knowing that you're probably still not going to be perfect, like, but this is a lot better of a strategy. Like we're landing the plane, and if we try to land this with the expectation that you're going to do it perfectly, you're probably going to crash. So like even though this might not be pretty and this might not be what you hoped it would be, it's still going to be better than the alternative.
I love what you said about the honeymoon phase, and I do want to touch on that really quickly because there is definitely a period, and not for every client, but for some clients where they are prepared, they are expected for this to be really hard, and then it's kind of like not the first 2 weeks, right? They're like, wow, I feel really great, everything's amazing, and then it's like 4 weeks in, like the rug gets pulled out of them, and then they still feel that way, right? So there is some times where it can be tricky, but I have yet to meet one person, whether I've coached them or I just know them, who doesn't struggle in some capacity across some domain post competition. And this is not to blame bodybuilding. This is not to blame anything, your coach, you, yourself, nothing. This is just the realities of what we're dealing with. And I think that it's just really important to give yourself that grace, but also build in those strategies of like, okay, what are my expectations? How can I actually manage this? And yeah, adding in untracked meals is probably one of my favorite things to do. And it seems really counterintuitive because we're thinking, okay, hey, the body is like primed physically to gain body fat, right? Based on all of the different hormonal and metabolic adaptations that are happening. Okay. Insatiable hunger, all of these different things. Primed to gain body fat, and psychologically, maybe not in the best, most sound of mind place right now, based on like my body image and just kind of how I'm feeling. Why would we add in all of this flexibility right now? But I have found in my experience that most people do better, like net better, whatever percentage better than if we were to not do that. And my goal as a coach is always like, we don't need perfection. How can we move forward productively though? So for me, I found that having that, and it goes back to what I mentioned a little bit earlier, where we're going to fully be present and fully enjoy this. When I tell a client like, hey, Corey, I know that you've just been prepping for, this past year, and I really want you to go have like a date night or like go have like a girls' night out or go do whatever. And like, I want you to order what you want. There's no restrictions here. I want you just to be present and be mindful, but just eat your meal, order whatever. And then the next day we can be right back on plan. That is so much more satisfying to someone than me being like, yeah, add 20 carbs for this refeed. And, like you can go out to eat, but like make sure it's like a plain potato. Like fucking nobody fucking wants that. Okay. And everybody, and here's the thing, even if someone does that for a few weeks, there might be a point where they crack. Or what we really want to avoid is any kind of overeating episodes. And that is going to happen to so many individuals, even if you have the strongest relationship with food. It is just bound to happen after, and it is much more psychologically damaging at that point because you're so delicate at that time. Also, again, physiologically very delicate. So if we start to compound like these like binge eating episodes, this is when we start to get the really, really rapid fat gain. And then that's when in 2 months, the client wants to diet again. And they're in quite literally the worst position to go into a deficit. So if we can avoid that, that is my number one goal. So that's why I like the untracked meals, even though they seem a little counterintuitive. I like those early on.
I think that's so relevant for a lot of listeners, even non-competitors who
Yeah.
maybe are wrapping up the fat loss phase, who are still finding like, well, I still want to come out of this. I want to come out of this, but hunger signaling, those adaptations are there. I think um, another tip and another like strategy I've used is post show or even post fat loss phase, getting to like allowing myself and really even forcing myself to romanticize those things that weirdly at the end of prep, they're still low calorie, but we weren't able to indulge in. So having like 400 grams of watermelon, be like, yeah, I know this is way too much. This is excess, but it's really good. And I don't have to check in pictures tomorrow, so I don't have to worry about my waist. Like, go crazy.
Watermelon's
Just
so good. So
it
good.
really no, it really is. And it's like, do like binge on that. Like I dare you won't be able to. Like you
Yeah.
won't be able to make a dent. Like before any kind of like instance of going for the high calorie food. Like if you can do the watermelon, like I'm just no one's taking me seriously because I'm not very serious on the internet to begin with. But no, like even like going back to hey, I know for the last 10 weeks, you've only been able to have like 100 grams of berries. I know you really like fruit. Okay, well, so with this caloric increase, I want you to indulge. I want you to indulge in those things that, frankly, you haven't had the luxury to think about for a long time. Instead of doing something, even like an untracked meal, like, can you do something at your house where it is still relatively
Mhm.
trackable? Maybe go get ingredients for like a stir fry, and that allows you to still stay within the constraints of like well, this isn't going to be as calorically dense as me eating out, but I get to, kind of do the non-bodybuilder thing. I get to make a meal that's very micronutrient dense, that's very palatable. But again, I love that you're encouraging individuals to one, be present and really, really explore like, okay, is this consumption or is this about the experience? Because I do think that that tendency to lean on food just for pure consumption, I think that I think it's novel and I think it's overrated, but I think it's also something that we get very comfortable with utilizing on a regular basis. But I know I've kept you for the last hour.
Oh, no, no, I'm
The
so
rain
fine.
sounds like it's
There's
sounds like it's there.
It actually isn't. So I'm like, "Oh, no, are you hearing something else?" No. So I'm in the if anyone's listening, I am, in a we're might be hit with a hurricane, might not be. So it's where the rain has already started, the wind has started, Florida things, but I'm used to it. But yeah, I think and this can go for not just post contest, but also just in general, right? So I want to make 2 points, so don't let me forget the second one. But just checking in with yourself, right? And this kind of goes back to the introspection of like, do I really want this? Do I really need this? Or is this just like a, ooh, like that kind of impulsive, like, let me go get this. And this is just a silly example for me. But right now, like I mentioned, I'm back in school. So I think it's really easy when you're doing something that's like hard to be like, I want a treat, right? Which everybody, we can all get treats. Like I'm not against a treat. But I also still want to maintain some kind of like, discipline in my life for certain things, right? So the other day I was like, oh, let me go get Starbucks. And I was like, I I really want this, but I don't really need like there was something in my body that said like you don't need that today. You don't need this $6 coffee right now. And I was like, okay, I'm listening to that. Like I'm not questioning it. I'm just saying I don't need it. So I think like over time, and that's such a small thing, like this isn't even like a calorie related thing, but this is just like a introspective and like a regulation thing that like you can get to the point where like you're checking in, like I said, is this consumption? Is this just like, do I feel like I have that need? Because there's like almost that like gnawing desire of like need that we can get. And anytime that comes up, I'm like, ooh, not a good time to indulge because I'm really not in the headspace that I need this when it kind of feels like that like gnawing sensation.
I oh gosh, I can relate to that so much, and
Right?
it's again, not a food thing, but it was like a
No.
tech thing, like, I saw something that was not inexpensive, and I, sent it to my boyfriend, I was like, "Oh, this is sick," and he's like, "You want it?" And I'm like, yeah, yeah, but it's like, I need to have some self-control because
Mhm.
I can't just be buying things like that, like, are you kidding me?"
Yeah.
Like and I was like, "But no, if I set, like, a goal for, like, the next 6 weeks, and I'm like, okay, if I make this amount of income, then I could get that," like, and honestly, it felt really good. Like, it felt like there was dopamine even in that just temporary pause,
Mhm.
but that very much translated for me. Later that day, I was like, "That is a very similar feeling whenever we're at a nice restaurant," and I know my boyfriend shouldn't do this, but he's like, "50% is yours." I'm like, doesn't make sense. We're not the same size." But that's how relationships work, right? So he's like, "Here, 50%." I'm like, okay, I'll for the things I really enjoy of this meal,
Yes.
50%, sure. But of the things that I'm like, this is really good, but it's not my favorite thing, okay, 30%. Like just having that ability to regulate and not necessarily restrict, I think there's reward kind of baked in.
Yeah, and part of the reward is you giving yourself that pause, right? Dopamine is all about the pursuit, which I think we've all been like beat over the head with. We all know that. But it really is about, even like you get that from that regulation perspective. And yeah, that's the difference of what is restriction versus what is restraint. And when we're able to apply that in our life and say, okay, maybe I don't need this right now, but maybe if I do come back to it and I really want it, in like in your example, like if I really like set this goal and I hit this and I still want it, okay, cool, I'll get it. And then I'll know that like that was actually something that I really wanted. And the example for me with the coffee that day, that was a really quick kind of fleeting example. But my day, I never thought about it once again until this podcast, right? So if it had been something that was really on my mind, right? Like the next day and the next day, okay, let me go get that coffee because I really want like small things like that. But we develop those regulation mechanisms, and that is so satisfying in the process. And it doesn't matter what your goals are, it will be useful. And then the last thing, I did come back tab. I have a bad tendency of that. So when we were talking about the untracked meals, so that is something that I do love, but I do ideally add those in beforehand. So I do want to make sure that everybody gets that. It's not like something where I've dieted a client for however long for, either a lifestyle cut or for a competition. And then I'm like, hey, let's add in this really hard thing after your show. Like we've already worked on untracked meals in a non-dieting phase when everything else is kind of stable, everything else is regulated, calories are high, everything's kind of just like rocking and rolling. So we've already developed the skills of untracked meals before a diet. So when I do add them back in, it's not like this whole shocking system. It's still a shock. It's still different than they're maybe used to, but it's not like we're adding a hard thing to an already hard situation. So I did want to make sure that that was clear, because if someone like hasn't tried it and then it's like, okay, well, let me try it. I say go for it, but it is just know it's going to be harder than if you had done it before the diet part.
No, no, absolutely. And I mean, even to piggyback off of that is like the way in which you diet, like the way that you are ending that diet, whether it's fat loss or physique competition sports, it's going to ultimately leach into the degree of willpower you have post. And if someone, I mean, like my last prep, I got very, very lean. I was very dysregulated, even though I was sitting at like a very high caloric intake for quite some time. But it's just simply the body fat that I was at. Like the hunger signaling was highly skewed. So it's like, even though everything by the book may have been done incredibly well, it's still like, no, the post show was not pretty. It still came with its own sets of challenges. And that's where I think clients like having some, I guess for listeners, having some grace and some understanding and really calibrating expectations to not completely, or I guess really largely tie their value with their ability to regulate those hunger signalings that frankly are going to be very dysregulated. Like that is a very expected outcome given the state that they were just in.
Absolutely. It is I always like to say it is very normal and expected. Doesn't feel great, but it is normal. You're definitely not the only one who is going through that. So doesn't make it any easier, but at least it's not it's not something to go, oh my gosh, I'm, the whole metabolic damage, right? That's why I try not to say the word damage, because of just what it implies. Damage is a great word in certain situations, but it's because of that, right? People think, oh my gosh, I'm broken. Something's wrong with me. No, this is normal. This is expected, but it is hard.
It is. I caught myself earlier because I said damage. I don't think it was related to
No, it wasn't.
metabolism,
You
but
said it in a fine way, but I saw you catch yourself. I was like, no, it was
I
fine.
was like, no, don't say it. Like,
Don't
just
say this word in
you're
front
like,
of her.
stop.
No, you said it in a great
Laurin,
way.
this has been amazing. Thank you so much for your time today.
Oh my gosh, of
You've
course.
got the coaching mentorship. I know you have a lot of plates spinning in the air right now, but where can people tune into your content, find out more about you, consult with you, hire you, support you, subscribe?
Yes. No, I really, really appreciate that. So yes, I don't know when this is coming out, but we are running the next cohort of the mentorship will start on October 7th. So in a few weeks. But so I will be offering that probably again in the spring. So stay tuned for that. That's all that is for coaches. But in terms of working with me, you can visit redefinehealthybrands.com. All the information is on there. I recently did just start up the YouTubes again, which is crazy to think. I'm back in the day. I was posting YouTube videos. So really what I wanted to do was document like kind of, hey, I'm, running a business. My life is very different at 32 and now I'm going back to school full time. What's that look like? And so I'm really just kind of diving in and just updating people. So that's back on my YouTube channel and then my Instagram. Both of those names are just at Laurin Conlin, LaurinCon.
Amazing. Guys, thank you so much for watching. Please leave us some feedback, like, comment, subscribe, and as always, we'll see you in the next one.